The wind screamed like something dying across the frozen plains, ripping the snow sideways in sheets so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The whole world was just white, a world of pure, blinding white. But something was moving in it. A figure, built like a mountain, shirtless against the razor-sharp air. His hair was long, streaming behind him like a banner, and it was the same shocking white as the snow. Every step was a battle. Every footprint he left was heavy, like he was carrying the weight of 1,000 years on his shoulders. This was Takakota Whitehair, a name that once made warriors tremble. Now he was just a ghost wandering through a world that had forgotten him. He wasn't looking for a fire. He wasn't looking for people. He'd given up on both a long, long time ago. The storm was his only company now. It was as lonely and as merciless as he was. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A faint cry, almost stolen by the wind. He stopped, the snow clinging to the hard muscles of his chest. He listened. It came again, weaker this time, pleading. The sound of a life about to be snuffed out. Every bone in his body told him to keep walking. But he turned. He turned against his own exhaustion, against his own despair, and through the curtain of falling snow, he saw it. A broken wagon, half swallowed by a drift. One wheel was splintered into pieces. The canvas top was ripped to shreds. Its meager contents were scattered across the snow like old forgotten bones. He pushed closer, his breath turning to steam in the frigid air. And that's when he saw her. A woman, curled up near the wreckage. She had a thin quilt pulled around her, but it was already half frozen. Her face was as pale as the moon. Her lips were blue, trembling with words that had no sound. She couldn't have been more than 25, but sorrow had carved deep lines into her face. He crouched down beside her, his shadow falling over her small body. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glazed with frost. She stared up at him, not like he was a man, but like he was a spirit born from the storm itself. "Please," her voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "Please, I'm begging you." Takakota's jaw set like granite. He looked away, out into the endless white, as if the blizzard itself could give him an excuse to leave. He was too old for this, too old for the hope and the fear and the desperation he saw in her eyes. It was a hunger for more than just survival. It was a hunger for connection. He muttered the words to himself, a final judgment on his own life. "I am too old for love." They felt like stones dropping into a deep, dark well. Her hand twitched, her fingers reached for him, a fragile, desperate gesture. "Don't leave me." Her plea had no pride left in it. It was the raw, naked cry of a soul that refused to just disappear into the snow. For a long, silent moment, Takakota didn't move. His stillness was as cruel as the wind. He had chosen this life of solitude for a reason. He had no family, no children, no clan to call his own. His white hair was the mark of an outcast, a man stripped of his place in the world. To take her in now, to let her knead into his cabin, into the frozen fortress of his heart. It was to risk everything. It was to risk being broken all over again. But as he watched her shiver, a memory sparked in the darkness of his mind. Many winters ago, he had pulled a child from the wreckage of a collapsed lodge. He had held her against his bare chest, sharing his own warmth until her shivering stopped. That child had lived. He never saw her again, but somewhere she was still breathing, all because he hadn't turned away. The storm howled with a new fury, trying to bury them both. A low growl rumbled in Takakota's chest. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, but her presence was heavier than any burden he had carried in years. Her head lolled against his shoulder. She whispered a few broken words of thanks before she slipped into unconsciousness. The journey back to his cabin was a brutal fight against the elements. The snow bit at his skin, clawing at the old scars that crisscrossed his back and arms. He sank deep into the drifts with every step, but he pushed on. He wasn't driven by kindness. He was driven by a stubborn refusal to let the storm win. He thought of his own words again. Too old for love. They burned in his mind with a new kind of shame. Maybe he was too old, but he wasn't so dead that he couldn't feel the sting of another person's pain. When the dark shape of his cabin finally appeared through the white veil, his breath was coming in ragged gasps. There was no smoke rising from the chimney. He had let the fire die hours ago, never expecting to bring anyone back. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and gently laid her on the fur-covered bench by the cold hearth. The cabin smelled of old leather and cedar smoke. It was as quiet as a grave. He moved with a speed that defied his age, not with tenderness, but with the brutal efficiency of a man who knew how to survive. He coaxed the fire back to life, the sparks dancing in the darkness. He set a kettle of water to heat. He pulled the thick blankets from his own bed and wrapped her in them. She stirred, her lips moving. "Please," she whispered, her eyes still closed. "Rest," he said. His voice was rough, a mix of command and his own deep unease. He sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, and just watched. The firelight painted shadows across her face. She wasn't beautiful in the way of soft, untouched women. Her beauty was in her resilience. It was in the lines of hardship etched around her eyes, in the stubborn set of her jaw even in sleep. Something about the way her brow furrowed cut him deeper than the wind ever could. Hours crawled by. The storm raged outside, shaking the very walls of the cabin, but inside, a fragile warmth began to grow. Her breathing became steadier, deeper. A lock of damp hair was stuck to her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and brushed it away. His fingers barely touched her skin, but he pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. He had no right. When she finally opened her eyes again, the firelight reflecting in them, she looked straight at him. Her voice was still ragged, but it was stronger now. "Why did you help me?" He stared into the flames, refusing to meet her gaze. "Because no one else would." Her lips parted, and a ghost of a smile, sad and broken, touched her face. "That's what they told me too." She turned her head, burying her face in the blankets. He could see her shoulders shaking. He could hear the soft, muffled sobs. And in that moment, Takakota's chest tightened into a knot of cold dread. He had assumed her plea in the snow was just for her life, but now he heard the deeper wound. The rejection that had driven her out into the storm in the first place. He saw a reflection of himself in her tears. The same cold verdict. Unwanted. Unnecessary. He stood up abruptly, needing to move. He paced to the window and stared out into the merciless, endless white. He pressed his hand against the cold glass. The storm wasn't letting up, and neither, it seemed, was she. Her voice, barely a whisper, floated across the room. "Please, I'm begging you. Don't send me away." His hand curled into a fist against the window pane. All his years of solitude, all the armor he had built around his heart, it was all for nothing. Her words had pierced right through it. For the first time in decades, he felt unsteady. He felt like the frozen ground beneath his feet was actually a river, and the ice was beginning to break. He didn't turn to face her. Not yet. But the silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was trembling with something dangerous, something alive. And outside, the storm beat against the walls, as if it was daring him to decide, daring him to choose what kind of man he was going to be. The fire cracked, sending a shower of embers up toward the dark rafters. A fragile warmth was pushing back against the cold, but the silence between them was a heavy, suffocating thing. Takakota sat across the hearth from her, a giant carved from stone and shadow. Eliza, the woman from the snow, was wrapped in his blankets, the color slowly returning to her face. With every small breath she took, he felt a strange crack in the ice around his heart. He hadn't shared his home, his space, with another living soul in years. She tried to sit up, a soft moan of pain escaping her lips. Before he could even think, he was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her. His touch was careful, almost gentle, but his hand was so large it nearly covered her entire back. She flinched, not from fear, but from the sting of her own weakness. "I can manage," she whispered, but her trembling arms told a different story. He said nothing. He simply guided her back down onto the furs. He poured steaming water from the kettle into a tin cup, then added a pinch of bitter-smelling herbs from a leather pouch. The same herbs his mother used to gather from hillsides that were now long gone. He pressed the cup into her hands. "Drink." Her fingers, as fragile as a bird's bones, brushed against his. She sipped the bitter tea, her face wrinkling, but she drank it all. Her eyes stayed on him, trying to read the secrets hidden behind his stern face. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked, her voice soft. He poked at the fire, sending a cascade of sparks flying. "Because silence does not lie," he said flatly, his gaze fixed on the flames. He was afraid to look at her, afraid that if he did, the truth in her question would cut too deep. But she was studying him in the firelight. His scars told stories she couldn't yet read. The long, faded lines across his back, the pale, puckered mark on his ribs. His age wasn't just in his white hair, it was in the profound weariness in his eyes. He was a man who had seen too much, lost too much. Yet, underneath it all, there was a strength that had never been broken. And something in her chest tightened. This man, this outcast, who claimed he was too old for love, had walked into a blizzard to carry her back from the dead. "What did you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Out there, in the snow, when you said you were too old for love." The question hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous. Takakoda went rigid, the firelight catching the hard line of his jaw. He took a deep breath, then slowly let it out. He shook his head. "It means what it means." His voice was low, final, a wall slamming shut. Shame, hot and sharp, burned in her chest. She pulled the blanket tighter, lowering her eyes. "Then I suppose I am only a burden to you." The words trembled with a lifetime of rejection. He turned on her, his eyes finally meeting hers, and they were as dark and turbulent as storm clouds. "You are alive," he bit out. "That is all." She flinched at his bluntness, but she didn't look away. Alive, nothing more. Even in his dismissal, she sensed something else. It wasn't cruelty, it was a shield. He wasn't protecting himself from her, he was protecting himself from what she represented. The hours passed, marked only by the shifting roar of the wind and the slow drip of melting snow from the quilt he had hung by the fire. She drifted in and out of a restless sleep, and every time she woke, he was there, tending the fire, grinding more herbs, or just sitting, as still and silent as the mountains themselves. He was a storm of his own, pacing the small cabin, a caged animal looking for an escape that wasn't there. Once, she stirred, a sharp pain shooting through her ankle. He was there in an instant, gently lifting the edge of the blanket. Her ankle was swollen and a deep, ugly purple. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, probed the bruised flesh. She gasped, then bit her lip to keep from crying out. "I told you I can manage." "You cannot walk on this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He tore strips from one of his own clean shirts and began to wrap her ankle. His movements were efficient but careful. She noticed the slight tremor in his breath when her skin brushed against his hand, a flicker of something he quickly suppressed. When he was finished, she whispered, "Why do you care at all?" He tied the final knot, his gaze still fixed on his work. "Because you begged me." She swallowed hard. The memory of her own voice in the snow, broken and pleading, filled her with shame. But it also filled her with a strange, fierce hope. For the first time in a long time, someone had actually listened. The night grew deeper. The blizzard clawed at the cabin, but inside, the firelight cast a warm, amber glow on the rough-hewn walls. Eliza was sitting up now, the quilt pulled to her chin, watching him. She couldn't make sense of him. The giant who walked shirtless through a blizzard but brewed healing tea with the patience of a medicine man. The warrior who claimed to be too old for love but had lifted her from the snow with a gentleness that screamed his indifference was a lie. "I have nowhere to go," she said, breaking the long silence. His hand, which had been reaching for the kettle, froze in mid-air. Slowly he turned to face her, his eyes lost in shadow. "That is not my burden." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Then send me back into the storm. It would be kinder than this." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she shrank back into the blankets, bracing herself for the final rejection. Takakota's jaw clenched so hard she could hear the muscle pop. He shot to his feet, pacing the cabin again, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stopped with his back to her, his whole body radiating a tense, furious energy. "I told you once," he said, his voice rough. "I am too old for ties. You will only find sorrow here." She closed her eyes, curling into a tighter ball, but her voice was surprisingly steady. "Please, I'm begging you, don't send me away." Those words, the same words she had whispered in the snow, cut through him like a knife. He turned slowly, and for a split second, he didn't see a stranger. He saw himself, years ago, cast out by his own people, stripped of his name, silently begging for a reason to keep going. The fire hissed, sending a plume of sparks upward, as if urging him to speak, to choose. But he was trapped between the armor he had worn for a lifetime and the stirrings of a heart he thought had long since turned to stone. She waited, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her breath held tight in her chest. The entire fragile weight of her hope was suspended on his answer, and he just stood there, silent, knowing that either choice would break him. The storm finally broke, leaving the world wrapped in a blanket of pristine, white silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, waiting silence before a judgment. At dawn, Takakota saddled his horse, the frost clinging to its dark mane. Eliza stood in the doorway of the cabin, wrapped in his quilt, her ankle still throbbing. "I can stay," she had argued, her voice weak. "Supplies are low," was all he said. The truth was more complicated. If she stayed, the whispers would start. If she came with him, the whispers would turn into a roar. The ride to town was long and cold. The horses' hooves crunched in the fresh snow, the sound echoing in the sharp, pine-scented air. Eliza held on to him from behind, her cheek pressed against the hard muscle of his back. He was as solid as a rock, but she could feel a warmth radiating from him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. He didn't speak the entire way, but the silence between them was different now. It was alive, charged with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. When they reached the small, snow-dusted town, the world seemed to shift. Faces appeared in windows, curtains twitched. The sight of the giant, white-haired outcast and the young woman wrapped in his quilt was a story that traveled faster than the wind. Children pointed, their eyes wide. Women clutched their shawls tighter, their mouths forming tight, disapproving lines. They stopped in front of the mercantile, and the bell on the door clanged like a warning. Inside, the air smelled of flour and coffee and something else, something bitter, judgment. Eliza tried to keep her eyes down, but she could feel their stares like physical blows. She had tasted gossip before, but this was different. This burned. Because it wasn't just her name they were dragging through the mud now. It was his. Martha Calhoun, the storekeeper's wife, stood by the counter, her face pinched with a sour righteousness. Her eyes swept over Eliza's quilted shoulders, then landed on Takakota's weathered face. Her lips curled into a sneer. "Well," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I see the storm brought in more than just snow." Takakota's back stiffened, but he ignored her. He moved through the store with a deliberate calm, gathering flour, coffee, salt. His silence was his shield. But Martha wasn't finished. "Some folks think they're above decency," she continued, her voice rising. "A young widow, shacked up in a cabin with him, no vows, no ring. What are the children to think of such shamelessness?" Eliza froze. The words hit her like stones. Widow. Shameless. She felt every eye in the store digging into her, stripping away the fragile layer of dignity she had just begun to grow back. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. For a fleeting, terrible moment, she wished the storm had just taken her. Then the door opened again, and Sheriff Amos Drayton walked in, his spurs clinking on the wooden floor. He was a man whose face had been hardened by years of suspicion. His gaze fell on Takakota and narrowed. "You'd best tread careful, Whitehair," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Folks around here won't stomach this kind of impropriety, not after all the years you've kept to yourself." Takakota met his gaze without flinching. "I've broken no law." "The law ain't the only thing that matters out here," the sheriff shot back. "Reputation does, and if you tarnish hers, you'll answer to me." Eliza's throat went dry. She wanted to defend herself, to defend him, but the words were tangled in a knot of shame and fear. Her ankle ached, her cheeks burned, and the quilt suddenly felt less like a comfort and more like a brand, marking her as a fallen woman. Then another voice, slick with mockery, cut through the tense silence. It was Nathaniel Pike, a local rancher with a cruel smile and cold eyes. He leaned against a barrel of nails, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look at him," he drawled, his eyes full of contempt. The old warrior, white as a ghost, playing husband to a girl half his age. "I'm surprised he can still lift a woman, let alone keep her." The laughter that followed was ugly and sharp. Takakota's hands, which were resting on a sack of flour, clenched into fists. His shoulders rose as he took a slow, deep breath. The muscles in his arms were coiled like springs, but he didn't move. He didn't speak. His silence was a weapon, but to Eliza it felt like a surrender. And that's when something inside her broke. She couldn't bear the shame anymore. She turned, her whole body trembling, and faced the room. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear and fierce. "I owe none of you an explanation for my life," she said, her eyes flashing. "But it was this man who carried me from the jaws of death while you all sat warm in your homes. If that makes me shameless, then let shame be my name." The store fell silent. Everyone stared at her, stunned by her defiance. Martha Calhoun's lips were pressed into a thin, white line. The sheriff looked uneasy. Nathaniel's sneer faltered. For the first time, Takakota looked at her. He truly looked at her, and in his dark eyes she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. It looked like pride. They gathered their supplies and left, the whispers following them out into the cold street like a pack of hungry dogs. Eliza's body was trembling, half from the cold, half from the sheer audacity of what she had just done. She felt broken and stronger than she had ever felt in her life. As Takakota helped her onto the horse, she touched his arm. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They will never see me as anything but a disgrace." He stared past her, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered mountains on the horizon. "They never saw me as anything else either." The simple, brutal truth of it hung between them, as heavy and cold as the winter air. She looked up at his face, and for a heart-stopping moment, she wanted to tell him he was wrong. She wanted to tell him what she saw when she looked at him. but the words wouldn't come. The ride back to the cabin was even longer than the ride to town. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple, and long shadows stretched across the snow. She buried her face in his back, not for warmth this time, but for courage. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, a solid, reassuring rhythm in a world that had just tried to tear her apart. In the distance, she could see a thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Safety. But the judgment of the town pressed in on them, heavier than any storm. Takakota was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a man facing a choice, a man weighing how much more he was willing to carry. When they reached the cabin, night had fallen. The snow glittered under a sliver of a moon. Takakota lifted her down from the horse, his hands firm and gentle around her waist. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the pale light, her lips parted with 1,000 unspoken words. He stood over her, a towering figure against the night sky, his white hair glowing like frost. Inside, the fire was waiting, but neither of them moved. The cold air was thick with everything they hadn't said. Eliza's breath hitched as she whispered, "If the world calls me shameful, will you?" Takakota's gaze locked with hers. His face was a mask, unreadable. The silence stretched between them, as taut as a drawn bowstring. The answer didn't come. But the weight of it, the terrible, crushing weight of it, felt like a storm that was just about to break. The cabin glowed, but the fire's warmth couldn't touch the cold that had settled between them. Eliza sat by the hearth, the quilt pulled around her like armor. The wounds from the town had cut deeper than any blizzard. Takakota paced, a restless shadow in the small room. His silence was a grinding noise, louder than any argument. "You said nothing," she finally murmured, her voice cracking not with anger, but with the hollow ache of being abandoned. "Not to Martha, not to the sheriff, not even to that man who mocked you." Takakota stopped, his back to her. His shoulders were squared, a mountain bracing for a landslide. "Their words are smoke," he said, his voice low and rough. "Smoke vanishes." Her lips trembled. "But smoke suffocates you before it fades. You think I don't know that? I've been breathing it my whole life." He turned then, his face half in shadow, half in firelight. The old scars on his chest seemed to gleam in the flickering light, memories of battles he'd survived but never truly left behind. "If I had spoken, they would not have heard me. My life was judged by men like them before you were even born. White hair, old blood, an empty home. I am nothing to them." Her chin lifted, a fragile, defiant gesture. "And what am I then? Nothing too? Just a burden you found in the snow and have regretted ever since?" The words hit him harder than Nathaniel Pike's sneer. He actually flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles around his eyes. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and crouched in front of her. "I carried you because you begged me," he said, his voice raw. "That is all." Her eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze, her own stubborn and unyielding. "And I'm still begging you," she whispered. "Don't send me away." The fire hissed, a log collapsing into a shower of embers. A shudder ran through Takakota's massive frame. He looked away first, rising to his feet and resuming his restless pacing. His white hair shone like spun silver in the firelight. "My husband died," Eliza said into the silence, her voice gaining strength. "3 winters ago. His family said I was cursed, barren. They drove me out with nothing but shame for a blanket. But today, in that store. When they called me shameless, I thought my heart would break. And then I looked at you. And for the first time in my life, I wished someone would fight for me. Not because I deserve it, but because you might actually see me." Her confession hung in the air, trembling. Takakota closed his eyes. Her words were pressing on old, deep wounds he had kept hidden for a lifetime. He remembered the whispers of his own people, the way they looked at his white hair not as a sign of wisdom, but as a curse. He too had been cast out. He too had been judged. To fight for her would mean fighting the same battle he had already lost so many years ago. He opened his eyes. She was watching him, her face a heartbreaking mix of hope and fear. And something inside him, something he had sworn was dead and buried, stirred. "I see you," he said at last, his voice rough, as if the words were being dragged up from the very center of the earth. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, it was enough. But then his gaze fell, the connection breaking. "But what I see is a life I cannot give you. I am too old, Eliza, too weathered, too marked by the world." Her hand slipped out from under the quilt. It was trembling, but she reached for him. "Then let me decide what I can bear." He stared at her small hand, so fragile against the backdrop of his own scarred existence. He didn't take it. He turned away again, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The fire flared, and the silence between them roared back to life. Later that night, Eliza lay by the hearth, her body aching for sleep that wouldn't come. She listened to him pace, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the wall between them. When exhaustion finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with mocking voices and hands that were always just out of reach. Takakota stood by the window, watching the moonlight on the snow. His reflection was a ghost, his hair like frost, his eyes hollowed out by years of solitude. He lifted a hand and pressed it to the cold glass, whispering the words that had become his creed. Too old for love. But as he said them, he heard her voice in his mind. "Please, I'm begging you." Dawn broke, gray and cold. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. Eliza rose, the quilt still wrapped around her, and limped to where he sat, sharpening a knife, his face unreadable. "Are you sending me away?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He looked up, the blade of the knife catching the morning light. "If you stay, the judgment won't stop. Every whisper will be a weight on your shoulders." She straightened, her face pale, but her chin high. "Then let them whisper. I have been judged my entire life. But here, at least I am alive." For the first time, the ghost of a smile touched his lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a flicker of grim admiration. He set the knife down, rose, and took a step toward her. He lifted his hand, and it hovered in the air between them, trembling slightly. The space itself seemed to vibrate, ready to shatter. She waited, her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But then his hand fell back to his side. His silence was a louder rejection than any word could have been. He turned from her and grabbed his coat. "I must see the sheriff," he said, his voice flat. A cold dread washed over her. "Why?" He didn't answer. He pulled the door open, and a blast of frigid air rushed in, scattering the warmth from the fire. For a moment, framed in the doorway with the wind whipping his white hair around his face, he looked less like a man, and more like a spirit of winter itself. Then he was gone. She was left with nothing but the fading echo of his footsteps and the hollow ache of all the words that had gone unsaid. She clutched the quilt tighter, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Please," she whispered to the empty room, "don't let this be the end." And outside, the wind snatched her words and carried them away, out into a world where judgment was waiting. He returned as snow began to fall again, fine brittle flakes like ash from a cold fire. Each of his footprints in the snow seemed heavy, final. Eliza was waiting by the hearth, her face a mask of exhaustion and dread. When the door opened, she searched his eyes for any sign of hope, of mercy. She found only the storm he carried inside him. "They will not stop," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He set his coat aside, the movement stiff. "The sheriff warned me. Martha Calhoun's tongue is spreading poison through the town. Nathaniel Pike is stirring up the other men. The whispers are getting louder. Eliza pulled the quilt tighter, a useless defense against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. And what did you tell them? Takakota's jaw was a hard, unforgiving line. He stared out the window at the swirling snow. That I am too old to fight their words. That I am too old to start a war I cannot win. The words were a blade, and they twisted deep in her heart. Her breath hitched. So I am to carry this alone? I am to stand in the fire while you turn your back? His eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time, a flicker of heat, of anger, broke through his icy calm. I carried you from death. Do not say I turned my back. She pushed herself to her feet, her weak ankle protesting, but her will was a rod of iron. You saved my life, yes, but living is more than just breathing. Living is dignity, and I would rather have died in that storm than be shamed into silence one more day. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearthstone, a sound like the clashing of swords. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling with the weight of everything he couldn't say. And then a sound from outside shattered the tension. Shouts, the heavy crunch of boots in the snow. Takakota was at the door in an instant, his body tense. Eliza was right behind him, her heart pounding against her ribs. He pulled the door open, and the scene outside stole the breath from her lungs. Nathaniel Pike stood in the clearing in front of the cabin. He wasn't alone. 2 other men, their faces hard and their eyes mean, stood with him. And behind them, at a distance, a small crowd of townspeople had gathered, their faces pale and curious in the gray light. Judgment had come to their door. Nathaniel's grin was a cruel slash in his face, his breath misting in the cold air. Brought yourself a wife out of the snow, white hair? Or just a little plaything to keep you warm until you get tired of her? The men beside him chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Eliza gasped, shame burning her cheeks like a slap. Takakota stepped forward, out of the cabin and into the snow. His chest was bare, his muscles coiled, his white hair whipping around his face like a blizzard in miniature. Leave, he said, the single word a low growl. Nathaniel spat on the ground. Not until this town knows the truth. You're a relic, old man. Too old and too broken to keep a woman like her. Why don't you let her speak for herself? Ask her if she wants a ghost for a husband. Every eye turned to Eliza. The silence of the crowd pressed down on her, suffocating her. She looked at Takakota. She saw the pain in his eyes, the flicker of that old, deep fear of being cast out, of being judged and found wanting. And in that instant, she understood. His silence had never been about her. It had always been about him. It was his armor. She stepped forward out of the cabin, the quilt dragging behind her in the snow like a royal train. If he is old, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, then I am blessed by the wisdom of his years. If he is broken, then his pieces have healed me. This man carried me when the world left me for dead. He is more of a man than all of you put together. A murmur went through the crowd. Nathaniel's smile wavered, replaced by a flash of angry pride. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. Then you're a fool, he snarled, and he's nothing but a... He never finished the sentence. Takakota moved faster than a striking snake. His hand clamped around Nathaniel's wrist like a vice, wrenching it away from Eliza. The other 2 men started to move, but a roar erupted from Takakota's chest, a sound so raw, so primal, that it froze them in their tracks. He shoved Nathaniel, sending him stumbling backward into a snowdrift. You speak of relics, Takakota growled, his voice a force of nature, but I am not yet buried. I have fought storms fiercer than your petty hatred. I have carried burdens heavier than your empty words. You call me old? Then listen to me now. Age does not kill a man's dignity. Cowardice does. The fire in his voice, in his eyes, seemed to shake the very air. Nathaniel scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation, but his cronies stayed put. The crowd shifted, their whispers turning from judgment to awe. Takakota turned his back on them all and faced Eliza. The storm inside him had finally broken. The truth, raw and powerful, was laid bare. "I told you I was too old for love," he said, his voice shaking with an emotion she couldn't name. "I was wrong. What I feared was not my age. It was the shame of being unwanted. But you saw me anyway. You begged me not to send you away. And I cannot. Not now. Not ever." Tears streamed down Eliza's face, freezing on her cheeks. She reached out and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it held all the fire of two souls who had been denied warmth for far too long. The crowd watched, uneasy, but no one spoke. Nathaniel spat one last time into the snow and then retreated, his mockery crushed under the weight of a dignity he could never understand. One by one, the townspeople turned and drifted away, leaving the clearing empty except for the two of them and the gently falling snow. The world was quiet again, but this time it was a cleansing silence. Takakota turned to her, his white hair glowing in the soft gray light. "If you will have me," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "then let the storm bear witness to our vows." Her answer was just a whisper, lost in the hush of the winter afternoon. "I will." The words, as simple as they were, seemed to ignite a flame that had been buried under years of ash and ice inside him. He gathered her into his arms, not as a burden to be carried, but as a treasure to be held. And for the first time in a lifetime, the small cabin in the woods was not a monument to solitude. It was a home. The wind died down, as if carrying their vows out into the world. The storm was over. But what had begun in its heart, that was just beginning. Love, they both knew now, wasn't measured in years or judged by the whispers of others. It was found in the quiet, terrifying courage of seeing another person's soul and daring to let them see yours. If you were moved by this story of courage and redemption, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.